Today, in Audiobooks for Me, we are going to listen to The Secret of Chimneys by Agatha Christie. This book is divided in 4 videos. This is Part 3. We hope you enjoy it. Chapter 16. Tea in the Schoolroom. Anthony regained the terrace with the feeling uppermost in his mind that the only safe place for private conversations was the middle of the lake. The resonant boom of a gong sounded from the house, and Treadwell appeared in a stately fashion from a side door. "Luncheon is served, my lord." "Ah," said Lord Caterham, brisking up a little. "Lunch." At that moment, 2 children burst out of the house. They were high-spirited young women of 12 and 10, and though their names might be Dulcie and Daisy, as Bundle had affirmed, they appeared to be more generally known as Guggle and Winkle. They executed a kind of war dance interspersed with shrill whoops till Bundle emerged and quelled them. "Where's Mademoiselle?" she demanded. "She's got the migraine, the migraine, the migraine," chanted Winkle. "Hurrah!" said Guggle, joining in. Lord Caterham had succeeded in shepherding most of his guests into the house. Now he laid a restraining hand on Anthony's arm. "Come to my study," he breathed. "I've got something rather special there." Slinking down the hall, far more like a thief than like the master of the house, Lord Caterham gained the shelter of his sanctum. Here he unlocked a cupboard and produced various bottles. "Talking to foreigners always makes me so thirsty," he explained apologetically. "I don't know why it is." There was a knock on the door and Virginia popped her head round the corner of it. "Got a special cocktail for me?" she demanded. "Of course," said Lord Caterham hospitably. "Come in." The next few minutes were taken up with serious rites. "I needed that," said Lord Caterham with a sigh, as he replaced his glass on the table. "As I said just now, I find talking to foreigners particularly fatiguing. I think it's because they're so polite. Come along, let's have some lunch." He led the way to the dining room. Virginia put her hand on Anthony's arm and drew him back a little. "I've done my good deed for the day," she whispered. "I got Lord Caterham to take me to see the body." "Well?" demanded Anthony eagerly. One theory of his was to be proved or disproved. Virginia was shaking her head. "You were wrong," she whispered. "It's Prince Michael, all right." "Oh," Anthony was deeply chagrined. "And Mademoiselle has the migraine," he added aloud, in a dissatisfied tone. "What has that got to do with it?" "Probably nothing, but I wanted to see her. You see, I've found out that Mademoiselle has the second room from the end, the one where I saw the light last night." "That's interesting. Probably there's nothing in it. All the same, I mean to see Mademoiselle before the day is out." Lunch was somewhat of an ordeal. Even the cheerful impartiality of Bundle failed to reconcile the heterogeneous assembly. The Baron and Andrassy were correct, formal, full of etiquette, and had the air of attending a meal in a mausoleum. Lord Caterham was lethargic and depressed. Bill Eversley stared longingly at Virginia. George, very mindful of the trying position in which he found himself, conversed weightily with the Baron and Mr. Isaacstein. Goggle and Winkle, completely beside themselves with joy of having a murder in the house, had to be continually checked and kept under, whilst Mr. Hiram Fish slowly masticated his food and drawled out dry remarks in his own peculiar idiom. Superintendent Battle had considerately vanished, and nobody knew what had become of him. "Thank God that's over," murmured Bundle to Anthony as they left the table. "And George is taking the foreign contingent over to the Abbey this afternoon to discuss state secrets." "That will possibly relieve the atmosphere," agreed Anthony. "I don't mind the Americans so much," continued Bundle. "He and Father can talk first editions together quite happily in some secluded spot. Mr. Fish," as the object of their conversation drew near, "I'm planning a peaceful afternoon for you." The American bowed. "That's too kind of you, Lady Eileen." "Mr. Fish," said Anthony, "had quite a peaceful morning." Mr. Fish shot a quick glance at him. "Ah, sir, you observed me then, in my secluded retreat." "There are moments, sir, when far from the madding crowd is the only motto for a man of quiet tastes." Bundle had drifted on, and the American and Anthony were left together. The former dropped his voice a little. "I opine," he said, "that there is considerable mystery about this little dust-up." "Any amount of it," said Anthony. "That guy with the bald head was perhaps a family connection." "Something of the kind." "These Central European nations beat the band," declared Mr. Fish. "It's kind of being rumoured around that the deceased gentleman was a royal highness. Is that so? Do you know?" "He was staying here as Count Stanislaus," replied Anthony evasively. To this Meister Fish offered no further rejoinder than the somewhat cryptic, "Oh boy," after which he relapsed into silence for some moments. "This police captain of yours," he observed at last, "Battle, or whatever his name is he the goods all right?" "Scotland Yard thinks so," replied Anthony dryly. "He seems kind of hidebound to me," remarked Mr. Fish. "No hustle to him. This big idea of his, letting no one leave the house, what is there to it?" He darted a very sharp look at Anthony as he spoke. "Everyone's got to attend the inquest tomorrow morning, you see." "That's the idea, is it? No more to it than that? No question of Lord Caterham's guests being suspected?" "My dear Mr. Fish!" I was getting a mite uneasy, being a stranger in this country, but of course it was an outside job. I remember now. Window found unfastened, wasn't it? "It was," said Anthony, looking straight in front of him. Mr. Fish sighed. After a minute or two, he said in a plaintive tone, "Young man, do you know how they get the water out of a mine?" "How?" "By pumping. But it's almighty hard work. I observe the figure of my genial host detaching itself from the group over yonder. I must join him." Mr. Fish walked gently away and Bundle drifted back again. "Funny fish, isn't he?" she remarked. "He is." "It's no good looking at Virginia," said Bundle sharply. "I wasn't. You were. I don't know how she does it. It isn't what she says, I don't even believe it's what she looks. But oh boy, she gets there every time. Anyway, she's on duty elsewhere for the time. She told me to be nice to you, and I'm going to be nice to you. By force, if necessary." "No force required," Anthony assured her. "But if it's all the same to you, I'd rather you were nice to me on the water, in a boat." "It's not a bad idea," said Bundle meditatively. They strolled down to the lake together. "There's just one question I'd like to ask you," said Anthony as he paddled gently out from the shore, "before we turn to really interesting topics. Business before pleasure." "Whose bedroom do you want to know about now?" asked Bundle with weary patience. "Nobody's bedroom for the moment. But I would like to know where you got your French governess from." "The man's bewitched," said Bundle. "I got her from an agency and I pay her £100 a year, and her Christian name is Genevieve. Anything more you want to know?" "We'll assume the agency," said Anthony. "What about her references?" "Oh, glowing. She'd lived for 10 years with the Countess of Whatnot. Whatnot being the Comtesses de Breteuil, Château de Breteuil, Dinard. You didn't actually see the Comtesse yourself. It was all done by letter." "Exactly." Said Anthony. "You intrigue me," said Bundle. "You intrigue me enormously. Is it love or crime?" "Probably sheer idiocy on my part. Let's forget it." "Let's forget it," said he negligently, having extracted all the information he wants. "Mr. Cade, who do you suspect?" "I rather suspect Virginia as being the most unlikely person. Or possibly Bill." "What about you, Sars?" "Member of the aristocracy joins in secret the comrades of the Red Hand. It would create a sensation all right." Anthony laughed. He liked Bundle, though he was a little afraid of the shrewd penetration of her sharp grey eyes. "You must be proud of all this," he said suddenly, waving his hand towards the great house in the distance. Bundle screwed up her eyes and tilted her head on one side. Yes, it means something, I suppose, but one's too used to it. Anyway, we're not here very much. Too deadly dull. We've been at Cowes and Deauville all the summer after town, and then up to Scotland. Chimneys has been swathed in dust sheets for about 5 months. Once a week, they take the dust sheets off and chars-a-bancs full of tourists come and gape and listen to Treadwell. On your right is the portrait of the 4th Marchioness of Caterham, painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds, etc. And Ed, or Bert, the humorist of the party, nudges his girl and says, "Eh, Gladys, they've got 2 pennyworth of pictures here, right enough." And then they go and look at more pictures and yawn and shuffle their feet and wish it was time to go home. Yet history has been made here once or twice, by all accounts. "You've been listening to George," said Bundle sharply. "That's the kind of thing he's always saying." But Anthony had raised himself on his elbow and was staring at the shore. "Is that a 3rd suspicious stranger I see standing disconsolately by the boathouse? Or is it one of the house party?" Bundle lifted her head from the scarlet cushion. "It's Bill," she said. "He seems to be looking for something." "He's probably looking for me," said Bundle without enthusiasm. "Shall we row quickly in the opposite direction?" That's quite the right answer, but it should be delivered with more enthusiasm. "I shall row with double vigour after that rebuke." "Not at all," said Bundle. "I have my pride. Row me to where that young ass is waiting. Somebody's got to look after him, I suppose. Virginia must have given him the slip. One of these days, inconceivable as it seems, I might want to marry George, so I might as well practice being one of our well-known political hostesses." Anthony pulled obediently towards the shore. "And what's to become of me, I should like to know?" he complained. "I refuse to be the unwanted 3rd. Is that the children I see in the distance?" "Yes. Be careful, or they'll rope you in." "I'm rather fond of children," said Anthony. "I might teach them some nice, quiet, intellectual game." "Well, don't say I didn't warn you." Having relinquished Bundle to the care of her gallant captain, Anthony strolled off to where various shrill cries disturbed the peace of the afternoon. He was received with acclamation. "Are you any good at playing Red Indians?" asked Google sternly. "Rather," said Anthony. "You should hear the noise I make when I'm being scalped. Like this," he illustrated. "Not so bad," said Winkle grudgingly. "Now do the scalper's yell." Anthony obliged with a blood-curdling noise. In another minute the game of Red Indians was in full swing. About an hour later Anthony wiped his forehead and ventured to inquire after Mademoiselle's migraine. He was pleased to hear that that lady had entirely recovered. So popular had he become that he was urgently invited to come and have tea in the schoolroom. "And then you can tell us about the man you saw hung," urged Google. "Did you say you'd got a bit of the rope with you?" asked Winkle. "It's in my suitcase," said Anthony solemnly. "You shall each have a piece of it." Winkle immediately let out a wild Indian yell of satisfaction. "We'll have to go and get washed, I suppose," said Google gloomily. "You will come to tea, won't you? You won't forget." Anthony swore solemnly that nothing should prevent his keeping the engagement. Satisfied, the youthful pair beat a retreat towards the house. Anthony stood for a minute looking after them, and, as he did so, he became aware of a man leaving the other side of a little copse of trees and hurrying away across the park. He felt almost sure that it was the same black-bearded stranger he had encountered that morning. Whilst he was hesitating whether to go after him or not, the trees just ahead of him were parted, and Mr. Hiram Fish stepped out into the open. He stared slightly when he saw Anthony. "A peaceful afternoon, Mr. Fish?" inquired the latter. "I thank you, yes." Mr. Fish did not look as peaceful as usual, however. His face was flushed, and he was breathing hard as though he had been running. He drew out his watch and consulted it. "I guess," he said softly, "it's just about time for your British institution of afternoon tea." Closing his watch with a snap, Mr. Fish ambled gently away in the direction of the house. Anthony stood in a brown study and awoke with a start to the fact that Superintendent Battle was standing beside him. Not the faintest sound had heralded his approach, and he seemed literally to have materialized from space. "Where did you spring from?" asked Anthony irritably. With a slight jerk of his head, Battle indicated the little copse of trees behind them. "It seems a popular spot this afternoon," remarked Anthony. "You were very lost in thought, Mr. Cade." "I was indeed. Do you know what I was doing, Battle? I was trying to put 2 and 1 and 5 and 3 together so as to make 4. And it can't be done, Battle. It simply can't be done." "There's difficulties that way," agreed the detective. "But you're just the man I wanted to see. Battle, I want to go away. Can it be done?" True to his creed, Superintendent Battle showed neither emotion nor surprise. His reply was easy and matter-of-fact. "That depends, sir, as to where you want to go. I'll tell you exactly, Battle. I'll lay my cards upon the table. I want to go to Dinard, to the chateau of Madame la Comtesse de Breteuil. Can it be done?" "When do you want to go, Mr. Cade?" "Say tomorrow after the inquest. I could be back here by Sunday evening." "I see," said the superintendent with peculiar solidity. "Well, what about it? I've no objection, provided you go where you say you're going and come straight back here. You're a man in 1,000, Battle. Either you have taken an extraordinary fancy to me, or else you're extraordinarily deep. Which is it?" Superintendent Battle smiled a little, but did not answer. "Well, well," said Anthony. "I expect you'll take your precautions. Discreet minions of the law will follow my suspicious footsteps. So be it. But I do wish I knew what it was all about. I don't get you, Mr. Cade." "The memoirs. What all the fuss is about. Were they only memoirs? Or have you got something up your sleeve?" Battle smiled again. "Take it like this. I'm doing you a favour because you've made a favourable impression on me, Mr. Cade. I'd like you to work in with me over this case. The amateur and the professional, they go well together. The one has the intimacy, so to speak, and the other, the experience." "Well," said Anthony slowly, "I don't mind admitting that I've always wanted to try my hand at unravelling a murder mystery." "Any ideas about the case at all, Mr. Cade?" "Plenty of them," said Anthony, "but they're mostly questions." "As, for instance?" "Who steps into the murdered Michael's shoes? It seems to me that that is important." A rather wry smile came over Superintendent Battle's face. "I wondered if you'd think of that, sir. Prince Nicholas Obolovitch is the next heir, first cousin of this gentleman." "And where is he at the present moment?" asked Anthony, turning away to light a cigarette. "Don't tell me you don't know, Battle, because I shan't believe you." "We've reason to believe that he's in the United States. He was until quite lately, at all events, raising money on his expectations." Anthony gave vent to a surprised whistle. "I get you," said Anthony. "Michael was backed by England, Nicholas by America. In both countries, a group of financiers are anxious to obtain the oil concessions. The Loyalist Party adopted Michael as their candidate. Now, they'll have to look elsewhere. Gnashing of teeth on the part of Isaac Stein and Company and Mr. George Lomax. Rejoicings in Wall Street. Am I right?" "You're not far off," said Superintendent Battle. Said Anthony. "I almost dare swear that I know what you were doing in that copse." The detective smiled but made no reply. "International politics are very fascinating," said Anthony, "but I fear I must leave you. I have an appointment in the schoolroom." He strode briskly away towards the house. Inquiries of the dignified Treadwell showed him the way to the schoolroom. He tapped on the door and entered, to be greeted by squeals of joy. Goggle and Winkle immediately rushed at him and bore him in triumph to be introduced to Mademoiselle. For the first time, Anthony felt a qualm. Mademoiselle Blanc was a small, middle-aged woman with a sallow face, pepper and salt hair, and a budding moustache. As the notorious foreign adventuress, she did not fit into the picture at all. "I believe," said Anthony to himself, "I'm making the most utter fool of myself. Never mind, I must go through with it now." He was extremely pleasant to Mademoiselle, and she, on her part, was evidently delighted to have a good-looking young man invade her schoolroom. The meal was a great success. But that evening, alone in the charming bedchamber that had been allotted to him, Anthony shook his head several times. "I'm wrong," he said to himself. "For the second time, I'm wrong. Somehow or other, I can't get the hang of this thing." He stopped in his pacing of the floor. "What the devil?" began Anthony. The door was being softly opened. In another minute a man had slipped into the room and stood deferentially by the door. He was a big, fair man, squarely built, with high Slavonic cheekbones and dreamy, fanatic eyes. "Who the devil are you?" asked Anthony, staring at him. The man replied in perfect English. "I am Boris Anchukov." "Prince Michael's servant, eh?" "That is so. I served my master. He is dead. Now I serve you." "It's very kind of you," said Anthony, "but I don't happen to want a valet. You are my master now. I will serve you faithfully." "Yes, but look here, I don't need a valet. I can't afford one." Boris Anchukov looked at him with a touch of scorn. "I do not ask for money. I served my master. So will I serve you. To the death." Stepping quickly forward, he dropped on one knee, caught Anthony's hand and placed it on his forehead. Then he rose swiftly and left the room as suddenly as he had come. Anthony stared after him, his face a picture of astonishment. "That's damned odd," he said to himself. "A faithful sort of dog. Curious the instincts these fellows have." He rose and paced up and down. "All the same," he muttered, "it's awkward, damned awkward, just at present." Chapter 17. A Midnight Adventure. The inquest took place on the following morning. It was extraordinarily unlike the inquests as pictured in sensational fiction. It satisfied even George Lomax in its rigid suppression of all interesting details. Superintendent Battle and the coroner, working together with the support of the chief constable, had reduced the proceedings to the lowest level of boredom. Immediately after the inquest, Anthony took an unostentatious departure. His departure was the one bright spot in the day for Bill Eversley. George Lomax, obsessed with the fear that something damaging to his department might leak out, had been exceedingly trying. Miss Oscar and Bill had been in constant attendance. Everything useful and interesting had been done by Miss Oscar. Bill's part had been to run to and fro with countless messages, to decode telegrams, and to listen by the hour to George repeating himself. It was a completely exhausted young man who retired to bed on Saturday night. He had had practically no chance to talk to Virginia all day, owing to George's exactions, and he felt injured and ill-used. Thank goodness, that colonial fellow had taken himself off. He had monopolised far too much of Virginia's society anyway, and of course if George Lomax went on making an ass of himself like this. His mind seething with resentment, Bill fell asleep, and in dreams came consolation, for he dreamt of Virginia. It was an heroic dream, a dream of burning timbers in which he played the part of the gallant rescuer. He brought down Virginia from the topmost story in his arms. She was unconscious. He laid her on the grass. Then he went off to find a packet of sandwiches. It was most important that he should find that packet of sandwiches. George had it, but instead of giving it up to Bill, he began to dictate telegrams. They were now in the vestry of a church, and any minute Virginia might arrive to be married to him. Horror. He was wearing pyjamas. He must get home at once and find his proper clothes. He rushed out to the car. The car would not start. No petrol in the tank. He was getting desperate. And then a big general bus drew up and Virginia got out of it on the arm of the bald-headed Baron. She was deliciously cool and exquisitely dressed in grey. She came over to him and shook him by the shoulders playfully. "Bill," she said. "Oh, Bill." She shook him harder. "Bill," she said. "Wake up. Oh, do wake up." Very dazed, Bill woke up. He was in his bedroom at Chimneys. But part of the dream was with him still. Virginia was leaning over him and was repeating the same words with variations. "Wake up, Bill. Oh, do wake up. Bill." "Hello," said Bill, sitting up in bed. "What's the matter?" Virginia gave a sigh of relief. "Thank goodness. I thought you'd never wake up. I've been shaking you and shaking you. Are you properly awake now?" "I think so," said Bill doubtfully. "You great lump," said Virginia. "The trouble I've had. My arms are aching." "These insults are uncalled for," said Bill with dignity. "Let me say, Virginia, that I consider your conduct most unbecoming. Not at all that of a pure young widow. Don't be an idiot, Bill. Things are happening." "What kind of things?" "Queer things. In the council chamber. I thought I heard a door bang somewhere, and I came down to see, and then saw a light in the council chamber. I crept along the passage and peeped through the crack of the door. I couldn't see much, but what I could see was so extraordinary that I felt I must see more. And then, all of a sudden, I felt that I should like a nice, big, strong man with me, and you were the nicest and biggest and strongest man I could think of, so I came in and tried to wake you up quietly. But I've been ages doing it." "I see," said Bill. "And what do you want me to do now? Get up and tackle the burglars?" Virginia wrinkled her brows. "I'm not sure that they are burglars. Bill, it's very queer. But don't let's waste time talking. Get up." Bill slipped obediently out of bed. "Wait while I don a pair of boots, the big ones with nails in them. However big and strong I am, I'm not going to tackle hardened criminals with bare feet." "I like your pyjamas, Bill," said Virginia dreamily. "Brightness, without vulgarity." "While we're on the subject," remarked Bill, reaching for his second boot, "I like that thingamy-bob of yours. It's a pretty shade of green. What do you call it? It's not just a dressing gown, is it?" "It's a neglige," said Virginia. "I'm glad you've led such a pure life, Bill." "I haven't," said Bill indignantly. "You've just betrayed the fact. You're very nice, Bill, and I like you. I dare say that tomorrow morning, say about 10 o'clock, a good safe hour for not unduly exciting the emotions, I might even kiss you." "I always think these things are best carried out on the spur of the moment," suggested Bill. "We've other fish to fry," said Virginia. "If you don't want to put on a gas mask and a shirt of chainmail, shall we start?" "I'm ready," said Bill. He wriggled into a lurid silk dressing gown and picked up a poker. "The orthodox weapon," he observed. "Come on," said Virginia, "and don't make a noise." They crept out of the room and along the corridor, and then down the wide double staircase. Virginia frowned as they reached the bottom of it. "Those boots of yours aren't exactly domes of silence, are they, Bill?" "Nails will be nails," said Bill. "I'm doing my best." "You'll have to take them off," said Virginia firmly. Bill groaned. "You can carry them in your hand. I want to see if you can make out what's going on in the council chamber. Bill, it's awfully mysterious. Why should burglars take a man in armour to pieces? Well, I suppose they can't take him away whole very well. They disarticulate him and pack him neatly." Virginia shook her head, dissatisfied. "What should they want to steal a mouldy old suit of armour for? Why, Chimneys is full of treasures that are much easier to take away." Bill shook his head. "How many of them are there?" he asked. taking a firmer grip of his poker. "I couldn't see properly. You know what a keyhole is. And they only had a flashlight." "I expect they've gone by now," said Bill hopefully. He sat down on the bottom stair and drew off his boots. Then, holding them in his hand, he crept along the passage that led to the council chamber, Virginia close behind him. They halted outside the massive oak door. All was silent within, but suddenly Virginia pressed his arm, and he nodded. A bright light had shone for a minute through the keyhole. Bill went down on his knees and applied his eye to the orifice. What he saw was confusing in the extreme. The scene of the drama that was being enacted inside was evidently just to the left, out of his line of vision. A subdued chink every now and then seemed to point to the fact that the invaders were still dealing with the figure in armour. There were two of these, Bill remembered. They stood together by the wall just under the Holbein portrait. The light of the electric torch was evidently being directed upon the operations in progress. It left the rest of the room nearly in darkness. Once a figure flitted across Bill's line of vision, but there was not sufficient light to distinguish anything about it. It might have been that of a man or a woman. In a minute or two it flitted back again, and then the subdued chinking sounded again. Presently there came a new sound, a faint tap-tap, as of knuckles on wood. Bill sat back on his heels suddenly. "What is it?" whispered Virginia. "Nothing. It's no good going on like this. We can't see anything and we can't guess what they're up to. I must go in and tackle them." He drew on his boots and stood up. "Now, Virginia, listen to me. We'll open the door as softly as possible. You know where the switch of the electric light is?" "Yes, just by the door." "I don't think there are more than two of them. There may be only one. I want to get well into the room, then, when I say go, I want you to switch on the lights. Do you understand?" "Perfectly. And don't scream or faint or anything. I won't let anyone hurt you." "My hero," murmured Virginia. Bill peered at her suspiciously through the darkness. He heard a faint sound which might have been either a sob or a laugh. Then he grasped the poker firmly and rose to his feet. He felt that he was fully alive to the situation. Very softly he turned the handle of the door. It yielded and swung gently inwards. Bill felt Virginia close beside him. Together they moved noiselessly into the room. At the farther end of the room, the torch was playing upon the Holbein picture. Silhouetted against it was the figure of a man standing on a chair and gently tapping on the panelling. His back, of course, was to them, and he merely loomed up as a monstrous shadow. What more they might have seen cannot be told, for at that moment Bill's nails squeaked upon the parquet floor. The man swung round, directing the powerful torch full upon them and almost dazzling them with the sudden glare. Bill did not hesitate. "Go!" he roared to Virginia, and sprang for his man as she obediently pressed down the switch of the electric lights. The big chandelier should have been flooded with light, but instead, all that happened was the click of the switch. The room remained in darkness. Virginia heard Bill curse freely. The next minute the air was filled with panting, scuffling sounds. The torch had fallen to the ground and extinguished itself in the fall. There was the sound of a desperate struggle going on in the darkness, but as to who was getting the better of it, and indeed as to who was taking part in it, Virginia had no idea. Had there been anyone else in the room besides the man who was tapping the panelling? There might have been. Their glimpse had been only a momentary one. Virginia felt paralysed. She hardly knew what to do. She dared not try and join in the struggle. To do so might hamper and not aid Bill. Her one idea was to stay in the doorway so that anyone trying to escape should not leave the room that way. At the same time, she disobeyed Bill's express instructions and screamed loudly and repeatedly for help. She heard doors opening upstairs and a sudden gleam of light from the hall and the big staircase. If only Bill could hold his man until help came. But at that minute there was a final terrific upheaval. They must have crashed into one of the figures in armour, for it fell to the ground with a deafening noise. Virginia saw dimly a figure springing for the window and at the same time heard Bill cursing and disengaging himself from fragments of armour. For the first time, she left her post and rushed wildly for the figure at the window. But the window was already unlatched. The intruder had no need to stop and fumble for it. He sprang out and raced away down the terrace and round the corner of the house. Virginia raced after him. She was young and athletic, and she turned the corner of the terrace not many seconds after her quarry. But there she ran headlong into the arms of a man who was emerging from a small side door. It was Mr. Hiram P. Fish. "Gee, it's a lady," he exclaimed. "Why, I beg your pardon, Mrs. Revel. I took you for one of the thugs fleeing from justice." "He's just passed this way," cried Virginia breathlessly. "Can't we catch him?" But even as she spoke, she knew it was too late. The man must have gained the park by now, and it was a dark night with no moon. She retraced her steps to the council chamber, Mr. Fish by her side, discoursing in a soothing monotone upon the habits of burglars in general, of which he seemed to have a wide experience. Lord Caterham, Bundle, and various frightened servants were standing in the doorway of the council chamber. "What the devil's the matter?" asked Bundle. "Is it burglars?" "What are you and Mr. Fish doing, Virginia? Taking a midnight stroll?" Virginia explained the events of the evening. "How frightfully exciting," commented Bundle. "You don't usually get a murder and a burglary crowded into one weekend. What's the matter with the lights in here? They're all right everywhere else." That mystery was soon explained. The bulbs had simply been removed and laid in a row against the wall. Mounted on a pair of steps, the dignified Treadwell, dignified even in undress, restored illumination to the stricken apartment. "If I am not mistaken," said Lord Caterham in his sad voice as he looked around him, "this room has recently been the centre of somewhat violent activity." There was some justice in the remark. Everything that could have been knocked over had been knocked over. The floor was littered with splintered chairs, broken china, and fragments of armour. "How many of them were there?" asked Bundle. "It seems to have been a desperate fight." "Only one, I think," said Virginia. But, even as she spoke, she hesitated a little. Certainly only one person, a man, had passed out through the window. But as she had rushed after him, she had had a vague impression of a rustle somewhere close at hand. If so, the second occupant of the room could have escaped through the door. Perhaps, though, the rustle had been an effect of her own imagination. Bill appeared suddenly at the window. He was out of breath and panting hard. "Damn the fellow!" he exclaimed wrathfully. "He's escaped. I've been hunting all over the place, not a sign of him." "Cheer up, Bill," said Virginia. "Better luck next time." "Well," said Lord Caterham, "what do you think we'd better do now? Go back to bed? I can't get hold of Badgeworthy at this time of night. Treadwell, you know the sort of thing that's necessary. Just see to it, will you?" "Very good, my lord." With a sigh of relief, Lord Caterham prepared to retreat. "That beggar, Isaacstein, sleeps soundly," he remarked, with a touch of envy. "You'd have thought all this row would have brought him down." He looked across at Mr. Fish. "You found time to dress, I see," he added. "I flung on a few articles of clothing, yes," admitted the American. "Very sensible of you," said Lord Caterham. "Damned chilly things, pyjamas." He yawned. In a rather depressed mood, the house party retired to bed. Chapter 18. Second Midnight Adventure. The first person that Anthony saw as he alighted from his train on the following afternoon was Superintendent Battle. His face broke into a smile. "I've returned according to contract," he remarked. "Did you come down here to assure yourself of the fact?" Battle shook his head. I wasn't worrying about that, Mr. Cade. I happened to be going to London, that's all. You have such a trustful nature, Battle. Do you think so, sir? No, I think you're deep. Very deep. Still waters, you know, and all that sort of thing. So you're going to London? I am, Mr. Cade. I wonder why. The detective did not reply. You're so chatty, remarked Anthony. That's what I like about you. A far-off twinkle showed in Battle's eyes. What about your own little job, Mr. Cade? He inquired. How did that go off? I've drawn blank, Battle. For the second time I've been proved hopelessly wrong. Galling, isn't it? What was the idea, sir, if I may ask? I suspected the French governess, Battle. A. Upon the grounds of her being the most unlikely person, according to the canons of the best fiction. B. Because there was a light in her room on the night of the tragedy. That wasn't much to go upon. You are quite right, it was not. But I discovered that she had only been here a short time, and I also found a suspicious Frenchman spying round the place. You know all about him, I suppose. You mean the man who calls himself Monsieur Shells, staying at the Cricketers? A traveller in silk. That's it, is it? What about him? What does Scotland Yard think? His actions have been suspicious, said Superintendent Battle expressionlessly. Very suspicious, I should say. Well, I put 2 and 2 together. French governess in the house, French stranger outside. I decided that they were in league together, and I hurried off to interview the lady with whom Mademoiselle Brune had lived for the last 10 years. I was fully prepared to find that she had never heard of any such person as Mademoiselle Brune. But I was wrong, Battle. Mademoiselle is the genuine article. Battle nodded. I must admit, said Anthony, that as soon as I spoke to her, I had an uneasy conviction that I was barking up the wrong tree. She seemed so absolutely the governess. Again Battle nodded. All the same, Mr. Cade, you can't always go by that. Women especially can do a lot with makeup. I've seen quite a pretty girl with the colour of her hair altered, a sallow complexion stain, slightly reddened eyelids and, most efficacious of all, dowdy clothes, who would fail to be identified by 9 people out of 10 who had seen her in her former character. Men haven't got quite the same pull. You can do something with the eyebrows, and of course different sets of false teeth alter the whole expression. But there are always the ears. There's an extraordinary lot of character in ears, Mr. Cade. Don't look so hard at mine, Battle, complained Anthony. You make me quite nervous. I'm not talking of false beard and grease paint, continued the superintendent. That's only for books. No, there are very few men who can escape identification and put it over on you. In fact, there's only one man I know who has a positive genius for impersonation. King Victor. Ever heard of King Victor, Mr. Cade? There was something so sharp and sudden about the way the detective put the question that Anthony half-checked the words that were rising to his lips. King Victor, he said reflectively instead. Somehow, I seem to have heard the name. One of the most celebrated jewel thieves in the world. Irish father, French mother. Can speak 5 languages at least. He's been serving a sentence, but his time was up a few months ago. Really? And where is he supposed to be now? Well, Mr. Cade, that's what we'd rather like to know. The plot thickens, said Anthony lightly. No chance of his turning up here, is there? But I suppose he wouldn't be interested in political memoirs, only in jewels. There's no saying, said Superintendent Battle. For all we know, he may be here already. Disguised as the second footman? Splendid. You'll recognise him by his ears and cover yourself with glory. Quite fond of your little joke, aren't you, Mr. Cade? By the way, what do you think of that curious business at Staines? Staines? Said Anthony. What's been happening at Staines? It was in Saturday's papers. I thought you might have seen about it. Man found by the roadside shot. A foreigner. It was in the papers again today, of course. I did see something about it, said Anthony carelessly. Not suicide, apparently. No, there was no weapon. As yet, the man hasn't been identified. You seem very interested, said Anthony, smiling. No connection with Prince Michael's death, is there? His hand was quite steady. So were his eyes. Was it his fancy that Superintendent Battle was looking at him with peculiar intentness? Seems to be quite an epidemic of that sort of thing, said Battle. But, well, I dare say there's nothing in it. He turned away, beckoning to a porter as the London train came thundering in. Anthony drew a faint sigh of relief. He strolled across the park in an unusually thoughtful mood. He purposely chose to approach the house from the same direction as that from which he had come on the fateful Thursday night. And as he drew near to it, he looked up at the windows, cudgelling his brains to make sure of the one where he had seen the light. Was he quite sure that it was the second from the end? And doing so, he made a discovery. There was an angle at the corner of the house in which was a window set farther back. Standing on one spot, you counted this window as the first, and the first one built out over the council chamber as the second. But move a few yards to the right, and the part built out over the council chamber appeared to be the end of the house. The first window was invisible, and the two windows of the rooms over the council chamber would have appeared the first and second, from the end. Where exactly had he been standing when he had seen the light flash up? Anthony found the question very hard to determine. A matter of a yard or so made all the difference, but one point was made abundantly clear. It was quite possible that he had been mistaken in describing the light as occurring in the second room from the end. It might equally well have been the third. Now, who occupied the third room? Anthony was determined to find that out as soon as possible. Fortune favoured him. In the hall, Treadwell had just set the massive silver urn in its place on the tea tray. Nobody else was there. "Hullo, Treadwell," said Anthony. "I wanted to ask you something. Who has the third room from the end on the west side? Over the council chamber, I mean." Treadwell reflected for a minute or two. "That would be the American gentleman's room, sir. Mr. Fish." "Oh, is it? Thank you." "Not at all, sir." Treadwell prepared to depart, then paused. The desire to be the first to impart news makes even pontifical butlers human. "Perhaps you have heard, sir, of what occurred last night?" "Not a word," said Anthony. "What did occur last night?" "An attempt at robbery, sir." "Not really? Was anything taken?" "No, sir. The thieves were dismantling the suits of armour in the council chamber when they were surprised and forced to flee. Unfortunately, they got clear away." "That's very extraordinary," said Anthony. "The council chamber again. Did they break in that way?" "It is supposed, sir, that they forced the window." Satisfied with the interest his information had aroused, Treadwell resumed his retreat, but brought up short with a dignified apology. "I beg your pardon, sir. I didn't hear you come in, and I didn't know you were standing just behind me." Mr. Isaacstein, who had been the victim of the impact, waved his hand in a friendly fashion. "No harm done, my good fellow. I assure you, no harm done." Treadwell retired looking contemptuous, and Isaacstein came forward and dropped into an easy chair. "Hullo, Cade, so you're back again. Been hearing all about last night's little show?" "Yes," said Anthony. "Rather an exciting weekend, isn't it?" "I should imagine that last night was the work of local men," said Isaacstein. "It seems a clumsy, amateurish affair." "Is there anyone about here who collects armour?" asked Anthony. "It seems a curious thing to select." "Very curious," agreed Mr. Isaacstein. He paused a minute and then said slowly, "The whole position here is very unfortunate." There was something almost menacing in his tone. "I don't quite understand," said Anthony. Why are we all being kept here in this way? The inquest was over yesterday. The prince's body will be removed to London, where it is being given out that he died of heart failure. And still nobody is allowed to leave the house. Mr. Lomax knows no more than I do. He refers me to Superintendent Battle. Superintendent Battle has something up his sleeve, said Anthony thoughtfully, and it seems the essence of his plan that nobody should leave. But excuse me, Mr. Cade, you have been away. With a string tied to my leg. I've no doubt that I was shadowed the whole time. I shouldn't have been given a chance of disposing of the revolver or anything of that kind. Ah, the revolver, said Isaacstein thoughtfully. That has not yet been found, I think. Not yet. Possibly thrown into the lake in passing. Very possibly. Where is Superintendent Battle? I have not seen him this afternoon. He's gone to London. I met him at the station. Gone to London? Really? Did he say when he would be back? Early tomorrow, so I understood. Virginia came in with Lord Caterham and Mr. Fish. She smiled a welcome at Anthony. So you're back, Mr. Cade. Have you heard all about our adventures last night? Why, truly, Mr. Cade, said Hiram Fish. It was a night of strenuous excitement. Did you hear that I mistook Mrs. Revel for one of the thugs? And in the meantime, said Anthony, the thug got clear away, said Mr. Fish mournfully. Do pour out, said Lord Caterham to Virginia. I don't know where Bundle is. Virginia officiated. Then she came and sat down near Anthony. Come to the boathouse after tea, she said in a low voice. Bill and I have got a lot to tell you. Then she joined lightly in the general conversation. The meeting at the boathouse was duly held. Virginia and Bill were bubbling over with their news. They agreed that a boat in the middle of the lake was the only safe place for confidential conversation. Having paddled out a sufficient distance, the full story of last night's adventure was related to Anthony. Bill looked a little sulky. He wished Virginia would not insist on bringing this colonial fellow into it. It's very odd, said Anthony when the story was finished. What do you make of it? He asked Virginia. I think they were looking for something, she returned promptly. The burglar idea is absurd. They thought the something, whatever it was, might be concealed in the suits of armour, that's clear enough. But why tap the panelling? That looks more as though they were looking for a secret staircase, or something of that kind. There's a priest's hole at Chimneys, I know, said Virginia. And I believe there's a secret staircase as well. Lord Caterham would tell us all about it. What I want to know is, what can they have been looking for? It can't be the memoirs, said Anthony. They're a great bulky package. It must have been something small. George knows, I expect, said Virginia. I wonder whether I could get it out of him. All along I've felt there was something behind all this. You say there was only one man, pursued Anthony, but that there might possibly be another, as you thought you heard someone going towards the door as you sprang to the window. The sound was very slight, said Virginia. It might have been just my imagination. That's quite possible. But in case it wasn't your imagination, the second person must have been an inmate of the house. I wonder now. What are you wondering at? Asked Virginia. The thoroughness of Mr. Hiram Fish, who dresses himself completely when he hears screams for help downstairs. There's something in that, agreed Virginia. And then there's Isaacstein, who sleeps through it all. That's suspicious too. Surely he couldn't. There's that fellow Boris, suggested Bill. He looks an unmitigated ruffian. Michael's servant, I mean. Chimneys is full of suspicious characters, said Virginia. I dare say the others are just as suspicious of us. I wish Superintendent Battle hadn't gone to London. I think it's rather stupid of him. By the way, Mr. Cade, I've seen that peculiar-looking Frenchman about once or twice, spying round the park. It's a mix-up, confessed Anthony. I've been away on a wild goose chase, made a thorough ass of myself. Look here, to me the whole question seems to resolve itself into this. Did the men find what they were looking for last night?" "Supposing they didn't," said Virginia. "I'm pretty sure they didn't, as a matter of fact. Just this, I believe they'll come again. They know, or they soon will know, that battle's in London. They'll take the risk and come again tonight." "Do you really think so?" "It's a chance. Now we three will form a little syndicate. Eversley and I will conceal ourselves with due precautions in the council chamber." "What about me?" interrupted Virginia. "Don't think you're going to leave me out of it." "Listen to me, Virginia," said Bill. "This is man's work." "Don't be an idiot, Bill. I'm in on this. Don't you make any mistake about it. The syndicate will keep watch tonight." It was settled thus, and the details of the plan were laid. After the party had retired to bed, first one and then another of the syndicate crept down. They were all armed with powerful electric torches, and in the pocket of Anthony's coat lay a revolver. Anthony had said that he believed another attempt to resume the search would be made. Nevertheless, he did not expect that the attempt would be made from outside. He believed that Virginia had been correct in her guess that someone had passed her in the dark the night before, and as he stood in the shadow of an old oak dresser, it was towards the door, and not the window, that his eyes were directed. Virginia was crouching behind a figure in armour on the opposite wall, and Bill was by the window. The minutes passed at interminable length. 1 o'clock chimed, then the half-hour, then 2, then another half-hour. Anthony felt stiff and cramped. He was coming slowly to the conclusion that he had been wrong. No attempt would be made tonight. And then he stiffened suddenly, all his senses on the alert. He had heard a footstep on the terrace outside. Silence again, then a low scratching noise at the window. Suddenly it ceased, and the window swung open. A man stepped across the sill into the room. He stood quite still for a moment, peering round as though listening. After a minute or two, seemingly satisfied, he switched on a torch he carried and turned it rapidly round the room. Apparently he saw nothing unusual. The 3 watchers held their breath. He went over to the same bit of panelled wall he had been examining the night before. And then a terrible knowledge smote Bill. He was going to sneeze. The wild race through the dew-laden park the night before had given him a chill. All day he had sneezed intermittently. A sneeze was due now, and nothing on earth would stop it. He adopted all the remedies he could think of. He pressed his upper lip, swallowed hard, threw back his head, and looked at the ceiling. As a last resort, he held his nose and pinched it violently. It was of no avail. He sneezed. A stifled, checked, emasculated sneeze, but a startling sound in the deadly quiet of the room. The stranger sprang round, and in the same minute, Anthony acted. He flashed on his torch and jumped full for the stranger. In another minute, they were down on the floor together. "Lights!" shouted Anthony. Virginia was ready at the switch. The lights came on true and full tonight. Anthony was on top of his man. Bill leant down to give him a hand. "And now," said Anthony, "let's see who you are, my fine fellow." He rolled his victim over. It was the neat, dark-bearded stranger from the cricketers. "Very nice indeed," said an approving voice. They all looked up, startled. The bulky form of Superintendent Battle was standing in the open doorway. "I thought you were in London, Superintendent Battle," said Anthony. Battle's eyes twinkled. "Did you, sir?" he said. "Well, I thought it would be a good thing if I was thought to be going." "And it has been," agreed Anthony, looking down at his prostrate foe. To his surprise, there was a slight smile on the stranger's face. "May I get up, gentlemen?" he inquired. "You are 3 to 1. Anthony kindly hauled him onto his legs. The stranger settled his coat, pulled up his collar, and directed a keen look at Battle. "I demand pardon," he said, "but do I understand that you are a representative from Scotland Yard?" "That's right," said Battle. "Then I will present to you my credentials." He smiled rather ruefully. "I would have been wise to do so before." He took some papers from his pocket and handed them to the Scotland Yard detective. At the same time, he turned back the lapel of his coat and showed something pinned there. Battle gave an exclamation of astonishment. He looked through the papers and handed them back with a little bow. "I'm sorry you've been manhandled, monsieur," he said, "but you brought it on yourself, you know." He smiled, noting the astonished expression on the faces of the other. "This is a colleague we have been expecting for some time," he said. "Monsieur Lemoyne, of the Sûreté in Paris." Chapter 19. Secret History. They all stared at the French detective, who smiled back at them. "But yes," he said, "it is true." There was a pause for a general readjusting of ideas. Then Virginia turned to Battle. "Do you know what I think, Superintendent Battle?" "What do you think, Mrs. Revel?" "I think the time has come to enlighten us a little." "To enlighten you? I don't quite understand, Mrs. Revel." "Superintendent Battle, you understand perfectly. I dare say Mr. Lomax has hedged you about with recommendations of secrecy. George would, but surely it's better to tell us than have us stumbling on the secret all by ourselves and perhaps doing untold harm. Monsieur Lemoyne, don't you agree with me?" "Madame, I agree with you entirely." "You can't go on keeping things dark forever," said Battle. "I've told Mr. Lomax so. Mr. Eversley is Mr. Lomax's secretary. There's no objection to his knowing what there is to know. As for Mr. Cade, he's been brought into the thing willy-nilly, and I consider he's a right to know where he stands." "But—" Battle paused. "I know," said Virginia. "Women are so indiscreet. I've often heard George say so." Lemoyne had been studying Virginia attentively. Now he turned to the Scotland Yard man. "Did I hear you just now address Madame by the name of Revel?" "That is my name," said Virginia. "Your husband was in the diplomatic service, was he not? And you were with him in Czechoslovakia just before the assassination of the late King and Queen." "Yes." Lemoyne turned again. "I think Madame has a right to hear the story. She is indirectly concerned. Moreover," his eyes twinkled a little, "Madame's reputation for discretion stands very high in diplomatic circles." "I'm glad they give me a good character," said Virginia, laughing. "And I'm glad I'm not going to be left out of it." "What about refreshments?" said Anthony. "Where does the conference take place? Here?" "If you please, sir," said Battle. "I've a fancy for not leaving this room until morning. You'll see why when you've heard the story." "Then I'll go and forage," said Anthony. Bill went with him, and they returned with a tray of glasses, siphons, and other necessaries of life. The augmented syndicate established itself comfortably in the corner by the window, being grouped round a long oak table. "It's understood, of course," said Battle, "that anything that's said here is said in strict confidence. There must be no leakage. I've always felt it would come out one of these days. Gentlemen like Mr. Lomax, who want everything hushed up, take bigger risks than they think." The start of this business was just over 7 years ago. There was a lot of what they call reconstruction going on, especially in the Near East. There was a good deal going on in England, strictly on the QT, with that old gentleman, Count Stilptich, pulling the strings. All the Balkan states were interested parties, and there were a lot of royal personages in England just then. I'm not going into details, but something disappeared in a way that seemed incredible, unless you admitted two things: that the thief was a royal personage, and that at the same time it was the work of a high-class professional. Monsieur Lemoyne here will tell you how that well might be. The Frenchman bowed courteously and took up the tale. It is possible that you in England may not even have heard of our famous and fantastic King Victor. What his real name is, no one knows, but he is a man of singular courage and daring, one who speaks 5 languages and is unequalled in the art of disguise. Though his father is known to have been either English or Irish, he himself has worked chiefly in Paris. It was there, nearly 8 years ago, that he was carrying out a daring series of robberies and living under the name of Captain O'Neill. A faint exclamation escaped Virginia. Monsieur Lemoyne darted a keen glance at her. "I think I understand what agitates Madame. You will see in a minute. Now we of the Sûreté had our suspicions that this Captain O'Neill was none other than King Victor, but we could not obtain the necessary proof. There was also in Paris at the time a clever young actress, Angèle Maury, of the Folies Bergère. For some time we had suspected that she was associated with the operations of King Victor, but again, no proof was forthcoming. About that time, Paris was preparing for the visit of the young King Nicholas IV of Czechoslovakia. At the Sûreté we were given special instructions as to the course to be adopted to ensure the safety of His Majesty. In particular, we were warned to superintend the activities of a certain revolutionary organisation which called itself the Comrades of the Red Hand. It is fairly certain now that the Comrades approached Angèle Maury and offered her a huge sum if she would aid them in their plans. Her part was to infatuate the young king and decoy him to some spot agreed upon with them. Angèle Maury accepted the bribe and promised to perform her part. But the young lady was cleverer and more ambitious than her employers suspected. She succeeded in captivating the king, who fell desperately in love with her and loaded her with jewels. It was then that she conceived the idea of being not a king's mistress, but a queen. As everyone knows, she realized her ambition. She was introduced into Czechoslovakia as the Countess Varaga Popolevsky, an offshoot of the Romanovs, and became eventually Queen Varaga of Czechoslovakia. Not bad for a little Parisian actress. I have always heard that she played the part extremely well, but her triumph was not to be long-lived. The comrades of the Red Hand, furious at her betrayal, twice attempted her life. Finally, they worked up the country to such a pitch that a revolution broke out in which both the king and queen perished. Their bodies, horribly mutilated and hardly recognisable, were recovered, attesting to the fury of the populace against the low-born foreign queen. Now, in all this, it seems certain that Queen Varaga still kept in with her confederate King Victor. It is possible that the bold plan was his all along. What is known is that she continued to correspond with him in a secret code from the court of Czechoslovakia. For safety, the letters were written in English and signed with the name of an English lady then at the embassy. If any inquiry had been made and the lady in question had denied her signature, it is possible that she would not have been believed, for the letters were those of a guilty woman to her lover. It was your name she used, Mrs. Revel. "I know," said Virginia. Her colour was coming and going unevenly. "So that is the truth of the letters. I have wondered and wondered." "What a blackguardly trick," cried Bill indignantly. The letters were addressed to Captain O'Neill at his rooms in Paris, and their principal purpose may have light shed upon it by a curious fact which came to light later. After the assassination of the king and queen, many of the crown jewels which had fallen, of course, into the hands of the mob, found their way to Paris, and it was discovered that in 9 cases out of 10, the principal stones had been replaced by paste. And mind you, there were some very famous stones among the jewels of Czechoslovakia. So as a queen, Angèle Maury still practised her former activities. You see now where we have arrived. Nicholas IV and Queen Varaga came to England and were the guests of the late Marquis of Caterham, then Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. Czechoslovakia is a small country, but it could not be left out. Queen Viraga was necessarily received, and there we have a royal personage and, at the same time, an expert thief. There is also no doubt that the substitute, which was so wonderful as to deceive anyone but an expert, could only have been fashioned by King Victor, and indeed the whole plan, in its daring and audacity, pointed to him as the author. "What happened?" asked Virginia. "Hushed up," said Superintendent Battle laconically. "Not a mention of it's ever been made public to this day. We did all that could be done on the quiet, and that was a good deal more than you'd ever imagine, by the way. We've got methods of our own that would surprise. That jewel didn't leave England with the Queen of Herzegovina. I can tell you that much. No, Her Majesty hid it somewhere, but where we've never been able to discover. But I shouldn't wonder," Superintendent Battle let his eyes wander gently round, "if it wasn't somewhere in this room." Anthony leapt to his feet. "What? After all these years?" he cried incredulously. "Impossible." "You do not know the peculiar circumstances, monsieur," said the Frenchman quickly. "Only a fortnight later the revolution in Herzegovina broke out, and the king and queen were murdered. Also, Captain O'Neill was arrested in Paris and sentenced on a minor charge. We hoped to find the packet of code letters in his house, but it appears that this had been stolen by some Herzegovinian go-between. The man turned up in Herzegovina just before the revolution, and then disappeared completely." "He probably went abroad," said Anthony thoughtfully, "to Africa as likely as not, and you bet he hung on to that packet. It was as good as a gold mine to him. It's odd how things come about. They probably called him Dutch Pedro or something like that out there." He caught Superintendent Battle's expressionless glance bent upon him and smiled. "It's not really clairvoyance, Battle," he said, "though it sounds like it. I'll tell you presently." "There is one thing you have not explained," said Virginia. "Where does this link up with the memoirs? There must be a link, surely." "Madam is very quick," said Lemoyne approvingly. "Yes, there is a link. Count Stilptich was also staying at Chimneys at the time." "So that he might have known about it?" "Parfaitement." "And of course," said Battle, "if he's blurted it out in his precious memoirs, the fat will be in the fire, especially after the way the whole thing was hushed up." Anthony lit a cigarette. "There's no possibility of there being a clue in the memoirs as to where the stone was hidden?" he asked. "Very unlikely," said Battle decisively. "He was never in with the Queen, opposed the marriage tooth and nail. She's not likely to have taken him into her confidence." "I wasn't suggesting such a thing for a minute," said Anthony, "but by all accounts, he was a cunning old boy. Unknown to her, he may have discovered where she hid the jewel. In that case, what would he have done, do you think?" "Sat tight," said Battle, after a moment's reflection. "I agree," said the Frenchman. "It was a ticklish moment, you see. To return the stone anonymously would have presented great difficulties. Also, the knowledge of its whereabouts would give him great power. And he liked power, that strange old man. Not only did he hold the Queen in the hollow of his hand, but he had a powerful weapon to negotiate with at any time. It was not the only secret he possessed. Oh no, he collected secrets like some men collect rare pieces of china. It is said that once or twice before his death, he boasted to people of the things he could make public if the fancy took him. And once at least, he declared that he intended to make some startling revelations in his memoirs. Hence, the Frenchman smiled rather dryly, the general anxiety to get hold of them. Our own secret police intended to seize them, but the Count took the precaution to have them conveyed away before his death. Still, there's no real reason to believe that he knew this particular secret," said Battle. "I beg your pardon," said Anthony quietly. "There are his own words." "What?" Both detectives stared at him as though unable to believe their ears. "When Mr. McGrath gave me that manuscript to bring to England, he told me the circumstances of his one meeting with Count Stilptich. It was in Paris. At some considerable risk to himself, Mr. McGrath rescued the Count from a band of Apaches. He was, I understand, shall we say a trifle, exhilarated. Being in that condition, he made two rather interesting remarks. One of them was to the effect that he knew where the Koh-i-Noor was, a statement to which my friend paid very little attention. He also said that the gang in question were King Victor's men. Taken together, those two remarks are very significant. "Good Lord," ejaculated Superintendent Battle. "I should say they were. Even the murder of Prince Michael wears a different aspect." "King Victor has never taken a life," the Frenchman reminded him. Supposing he was surprised when he was searching for the jewel. "Is he in England, then?" asked Anthony sharply. "You say that he was released a few months ago. Didn't you keep track of him?" A rather rueful smile overspread the French detective's face. "We tried to, monsieur. But he is a devil, that man. He gave us the slip at once. At once. We thought, of course, that he would make straight for England. But no. He went— where do you think?" "Where?" said Anthony. He was staring intently at the Frenchman, and absent-mindedly his fingers played with a box of matches. "To America. To the United States." "What?" There was sheer amazement in Anthony's tone. "Yes, and what do you think he called himself? What part do you think he played over there? The part of Prince Nicholas of Czechoslovakia." The matchbox fell from Anthony's hand, but his amazement was fully equalled by that of Battle. "Impossible." "Not so, my friend. You too will get the news in the morning. It has been the most colossal bluff. As you know, Prince Nicholas was rumoured to have died in the Congo years ago. Our friend King Victor seizes on that. Difficult to prove a death of that kind. He resurrects Prince Nicholas and plays him to such purpose that he gets away with a tremendous haul of American dollars, all on account of the supposed oil concessions. But by a mere accident, he was unmasked and had to leave the country hurriedly. This time he did come to England, and that is why I am here. Sooner or later, he will come to Chimneys. That is, if he is not already here." "You think that?" "I think he was here the night Prince Michael died, and again last night." "It was another attempt, eh?" said Battle. "It was another attempt." "What has bothered me," continued Battle, "was wondering what had become of Monsieur Lemoyne here. I'd had word from Paris that he was on his way over to work with me, and I couldn't make out why he hadn't turned up." "I must indeed apologise," said Lemoyne. "You see, I arrived on the morning after the murder. It occurred to me at once that it would be as well for me to study things from an unofficial standpoint without appearing officially as your colleague. I thought that great possibilities lay that way. I was, of course, aware that I was bound to be an object of suspicion, but that in a way furthered my plan, since it would not put people I was after on their guard. I can assure you that I have seen a good deal that is interesting in the last 2 days." "But look here," said Bill. "What really did happen last night?" "I am afraid," said Monsieur Lemoyne, "that I gave you rather violent exercise. It was you I chased then?" "Yes, I will recount things to you. I came up here to watch, convinced that the secret had to do with this room since the prince had been killed here. I stood outside on the terrace. Presently, I became aware that someone was moving about in this room. I could see the flash of a torch now and again. I tried the middle window and found it unlatched. Whether the man had entered that way earlier, or whether he had left it so as a blind in case he was disturbed, I do not know. Very gently I pushed it back and slipped inside the room. Step by step I felt my way until I was in a spot where I could watch operations without likelihood of being discovered myself. The man himself I could not see clearly. His back was to me, of course, and he was silhouetted against the light of the torch so that his outline only could be seen. But his actions filled me with surprise. He took to pieces first one, and then the other of those 2 suits of armour, examining each one piece by piece. When he had convinced himself that what he sought was not there, he began tapping the panelling of the wall under that picture. What he would have done next, I do not know. The interruption came. You burst in. He looked at Bill. Our well-meant interference was really rather a pity, said Virginia thoughtfully. In a sense, madam, it was. The man switched out his torch, and I, who had no wish as yet to be forced to reveal my identity, sprang for the window. I collided with the other 2 in the dark and fell headlong. I sprang up and out through the window. Mr. Eversley, taking me for his assailant, followed. I followed you first, said Virginia. Bill was only second in the race. And the other fellow had the sense to stay still and sneak out through the door. I wonder he didn't meet the rescuing crowd. That would present no difficulties, said Lemoyne. He would be a rescuer in advance of the rest, that was all. Do you really think this Arsène Lupin fellow is actually among the household now? Asked Bill, his eyes sparkling. Why not? Said Lemoyne. He could pass perfectly as a servant. For all we may know, he may be Boris Anchukov, the trusted servant of the late Prince Michael. He's an odd-looking bloke, agreed Bill, but Anthony was smiling. That's hardly worthy of you, Monsieur Lemoyne, he said gently. The Frenchman smiled too. You've taken him on as your valet now. Haven't you, Mr. Cade? Asked Superintendent Battle. Battle, I take off my hat to you. You know everything. But just as a matter of detail, he's taken me on, not I him. Why was that, I wonder, Mr. Cade? I don't know, said Anthony lightly. It's a curious taste, but perhaps he may have liked my face. Or he may think I murdered his master and wish to establish himself in a handy position for executing revenge upon me. He rose and went over to the windows, pulling the curtains. Daylight, he said with a slight yawn. There won't be any more excitements now. Lemoyne rose also. I will leave you, he said. We shall perhaps meet again later in the day. With a graceful bow to Virginia, he stepped out of the window. Bed, said Virginia, yawning. It's all been very exciting. Come on, Bill. Go to bed like a good little boy. The breakfast table will see us not, I fear. Anthony stayed at the window looking after the retreating form of Monsieur Lemoyne. You wouldn't think it, said Battle behind him, but that's supposed to be the cleverest detective in France. I don't know that I wouldn't, said Anthony thoughtfully. I rather think I would. Well, said Battle, he was right about the excitements of this night being over. By the way, do you remember my telling you about that man they'd found shot near Staines? Yes. Why? Nothing. They've identified him, that's all. It seems he was called Giuseppe Manelli. He was a waiter at the Blitz in London. Curious, isn't it? Chapter 20. Battle and Anthony confer. Anthony said nothing. He continued to stare out of the window. Superintendent Battle looked for some time at his motionless back. Well, good night, sir, he said at last, and moved to the door. Anthony stirred. Wait a minute, Battle. The superintendent halted obediently. Anthony left the window. He drew out a cigarette from his case and lighted it. Then, between 2 puffs of smoke, he said, You seem very interested in this business at Staines. I wouldn't go as far as that, sir. It's unusual, that's all. Do you think the man was shot where he was found? Or do you think he was killed elsewhere and the body brought to that particular spot afterwards? I think he was shot somewhere else, and the body brought there in a car. I think so too, said Anthony. Something in the emphasis of his tone made the detective look up sharply. Any ideas of your own, sir? Do you know who brought him there? Yes, said Anthony. I did. He was a little annoyed at the absolutely unruffled calm preserved by the other. I must say you take these shocks very well, Battle, he remarked. Never display emotion. That was a rule that was given to me once, and I found it very useful." "You live up to it, certainly," said Anthony. "I can't say I've ever seen you ruffled. Well, do you want to hear the whole story?" "If you please, Mr. Cade." Anthony pulled up 2 of the chairs. Both men sat down, and Anthony recounted the events of the preceding Thursday night. Battle listened immovably. There was a far-off twinkle in his eyes as Anthony finished. "You know, sir," he said, "you'll get into trouble one of these days." "Then, for the second time, I'm not to be taken into custody." "We always like to give a man plenty of rope," said Superintendent Battle. "Very delicately put," said Anthony, without unduly stressing the end of the proverb. "What I can't quite make out, sir," said Battle, "is why you decided to come across with this now." "It's rather difficult to explain," said Anthony. "You see, Battle, I've come to have really a very high opinion of your abilities. When the moment comes, you're always there. Look at tonight. And it occurred to me that in withholding this knowledge of mine, I was seriously cramping your style. You deserve to have access to all the facts. I've done what I could, and up to now, I've made a mess of things. Until tonight, I couldn't speak for Mrs. Revell's sake, but now that those letters have been definitely proved to have nothing whatever to do with her, any idea of her complicity becomes absurd. Perhaps I advised her badly in the first place, but it struck me that her statement of having paid this man money to suppress the letters, simply as a whim, might take a bit of believing." "It might by a jury," agreed Battle. "Juries never have any imagination." "But you accept it quite easily," said Anthony, looking curiously at him. "Well, you see, Mr. Cade, most of my work has lain amongst these people. What they call the upper classes, I mean. You see, the majority of people are always wondering what the neighbours will think. But tramps and aristocrats don't. They just do the first thing that comes into their heads, and they don't bother to think what anyone thinks of them. I'm not meaning just the idle rich, the people who give big parties and so on. I mean those that have had it born and bred in them for generations, that nobody else's opinion counts but their own. I've always found the upper classes the same, fearless, truthful, and sometimes extraordinarily foolish." "This is a very interesting lecture, Battle. I suppose you'll be writing your reminiscences one of these days. They ought to be worth reading too." The detective acknowledged the suggestion with a smile, but said nothing. "I'd rather like to ask you one question," continued Anthony. "Did you connect me at all with the Staines affair? I fancied from your manner that you did." "Quite right. I had a hunch that way, but nothing definite to go upon. Your manner was very good, if I may say so, Mr. Cade. You never overdid the carelessness." "I'm glad of that," said Anthony. "I've a feeling that ever since I met you, you've been laying little traps for me. On the whole, I've managed to avoid falling into them, but the strain has been acute." Battle smiled grimly. "That's how you get a crook in the end, sir. Keep him on the run, to and fro, turning and twisting. Sooner or later his nerve goes, and you've got him." "You're a cheerful fellow, Battle. When will you get me, I wonder?" "Plenty of rope, sir," quoted the superintendent. "Plenty of rope." "In the meantime," said Anthony, "I am still the amateur assistant?" "That's it, Mr. Cade. Watson to your Sherlock, in fact." "Detective stories are mostly bunkum," said Battle, unemotionally. "But they amuse people," he added as an afterthought, "and they're useful sometimes." "In what way?" asked Anthony curiously. "They encourage the universal idea that the police are stupid. When we get an amateur crime, such as a murder, that's very useful indeed." Anthony looked at him for some minutes in silence. Battle sat quite still, blinking now and then with no expression whatsoever on his square, placid face. Presently he rose. "Not much good going to bed now," he observed. "As soon as he's up, I want to have a few words with his lordship. Anyone who wants to leave the house can do so now. At the same time, I should be much obliged to his lordship if he'll extend an informal invitation to his guests to stay on. You'll accept it, sir, if you please, and Mrs. Revel also. Have you ever found the revolver? Asked Anthony suddenly. You mean the one Prince Michael was shot with? No, I haven't. Yet it must be in the house or grounds. I'll take a hint from you, Mr. Cade, and send some boys up bird's nesting. If I could get hold of the revolver, we might get forward a bit. That and the bundle of letters. You say that a letter with the heading Chimneys was amongst them. Depend upon it, that was the last one written. The instructions for finding the diamond are written in code in that letter. What's your theory of the killing of Giuseppe? Asked Anthony. I should say he was a regular thief and that he was got hold of either by King Victor or by the comrades of the Red Hand and employed by them. I shouldn't wonder at all if the comrades and King Victor aren't working together. The organisation has plenty of money and power, but it isn't very strong in brains. Giuseppe's task was to steal the memoirs. They couldn't have known that you had the letters. It's a very odd coincidence that you should have, by the way. I know, said Anthony. It's amazing when you come to think of it. Giuseppe gets hold of the letters instead, is at first vastly chagrined, then sees the cutting from the paper and has the brilliant idea of turning them to account on his own by blackmailing the lady. He has, of course, no idea of their real significance. The comrades find out what he is doing, believe that he is deliberately double-crossing them, and decree his death. They're very fond of executing traitors. It has a picturesque element which seems to appeal to them. What I can't quite make out is the revolver with Virginia engraved upon it. There's too much finesse about that for the comrades. As a rule, they enjoy plastering their Red Hand sign about, in order to strike terror into other would-be traitors. No, it looks to me as though King Victor had stepped in there. But what his motive was, I don't know. It looks like a very deliberate attempt to saddle Mrs. Revel with the murder, and, on the surface, there doesn't seem any particular point in that. I had a theory, said Anthony, but it didn't work out according to plan. He told Battle of Virginia's recognition of Michael. Battle nodded his head. Oh yes, no doubt as to his identity. By the way, that old baron has a very high opinion of you. He speaks of you in most enthusiastic terms. That's very kind of him, said Anthony, especially as I've given him full warning that I mean to do my utmost to get hold of the missing memoirs before Wednesday next. You'll have a job to do that, said Battle. Yes, you think so? I suppose King Victor and company have got the letters. Battle nodded. Pinched them off Giuseppe that day in Pont Street. Prettily planned piece of work, that. Yes, they've got 'em all right and they've decoded them, and they know where to look. Both men were on the point of passing out of the room. In here, said Anthony, jerking his head back. Exactly, in here. But they haven't found the prize yet, and they're going to run a pretty risk trying to get it. I suppose, said Anthony, that you've got a plan in that subtle head of yours. Battle returned no answer. He looked particularly stolid and unintelligent. Then, very slowly, he winked. Want my help? Asked Anthony. I do, and I shall want someone else's. Who is that? Mrs. Revel's. You may not have noticed it, Mr. Cade, but she's a lady who has a particularly beguiling way with her. I've noticed it all right, said Anthony. He glanced at his watch. I'm inclined to agree with you about bed, Battle. A dip in the lake and a hearty breakfast will be far more to the point. He ran lightly upstairs to his bedroom. Whistling to himself, he discarded his evening clothes and picked up a dressing gown and a bath towel. Then suddenly he stopped dead in front of the dressing table, staring at the object that reposed demurely in front of the looking-glass. For a moment he could not believe his eyes. He took it up, examined it closely. Yes, there was no mistake. It was the bundle of letters signed Virginia Revel. They were intact. Not one was missing. Anthony dropped into a chair, the letters in his hand. My brain must be cracking, he murmured. "I can't understand a quarter of what is going on in this house. Why should the letters reappear like a damned conjuring trick? Who put them on my dressing table? Why?" And to all these very pertinent questions, he could find no satisfactory reply. Chapter 21. Mr. Isaacstein's Suitcase. At 10 o'clock that morning, Lord Caterham and his daughter were breakfasting. Bundle was looking very thoughtful. "Father," she said at last. Lord Caterham, absorbed in the Times, did not reply. "Father," said Bundle again, more sharply. Lord Caterham, torn from his interested perusal of forthcoming sales of rare books, looked up absent-mindedly. "Eh?" he said. "Did you speak?" "Yes? Who is it? Who's had breakfast?" She nodded towards a place that had evidently been occupied. The rest were all expectant. "Oh, what's his name?" "Fat Ikey." Bundle and her father had enough sympathy between them to comprehend each other's somewhat misleading observations. "That's it." "Did I see you talking to the detective this morning before breakfast?" Lord Caterham sighed. "Yes, he buttonholed me in the hall. I do think the hours before breakfast should be sacred. I shall have to go abroad. The strain on my nerves." Bundle interrupted unceremoniously. "What did he say?" "Said everyone who wanted to could clear out." "Well," said Bundle, "that's all right. That's what you've been wanting." "I know, but he didn't leave it at that. He went on to say that nevertheless he wanted me to ask everyone to stay on." "I don't understand," said Bundle, wrinkling her nose. "So confusing and contradictory," complained Lord Caterham. "And before breakfast, too." "What did you say?" "Oh, I agreed. Of course, it's never any good arguing with these people, especially before breakfast," continued Lord Caterham, reverting to his principal grievance. "Who have you asked so far?" "Cade. He was up very early this morning. He's going to stop on. I don't mind that. I can't quite make the fellow out, but I like him. I like him very much." "So does Virginia," said Bundle, drawing a pattern on the table with her fork. "Eh? And so do I. But that doesn't seem to matter." "And I asked Isaacstein," continued Lord Caterham. "Well?" "But fortunately he's got to go back to town. Don't forget to order the car for the 10.40, by the way." "All right." "Now, if I can only get rid of Fish, too," continued Lord Caterham, his spirits rising. "I thought you liked talking to him about your mouldy old books." "So I do. So I do. So I did, rather. But it gets monotonous when one finds that one is always doing all the talking. Fish is very interested, but he never volunteers any statements of his own. It's better than doing all the listening," said Bundle, "like one does with George Lomax." Lord Caterham shuddered at the remembrance. "George is all very well on platforms," said Bundle. "I've clapped him myself, though of course I know all the time that he's talking balderdash. And anyway, I'm a socialist." "I know, my dear, I know," said Lord Caterham hastily. "It's all right," said Bundle. "I'm not going to bring politics into the house. That's what George does, public speaking in private life. It ought to be abolished by Act of Parliament." "Quite so," said Lord Caterham. "What about Virginia?" asked Bundle. "Is she to be asked to stop on?" "Battle said everybody." "Says he firmly. Have you asked her to be my stepma yet?" "I don't think it would be any good," said Lord Caterham mournfully, "although she did call me a darling last night. But that's the worst of these attractive young women with affectionate dispositions. They'll say anything, and they mean absolutely nothing by it." "No," agreed Bundle. "It would have been much more hopeful if she'd thrown a boot at you or tried to bite you. You modern young people seem to have such unpleasant ideas about love-making," said Lord Caterham plaintively. "It comes from reading the Sheik," said Bundle. "Desert love. Throw her about, etc." "What is the Sheik?" asked Lord Caterham simply. "Is it a poem?" Bundle looked at him with commiserating pity. Then she rose and kissed the top of his head. "Dear old Daddy," she remarked, and sprang lightly out of the window. Lord Caterham went back to the sale rooms. He jumped when addressed suddenly by Mr. Hiram Fish, who had made his usual noiseless entry. "Good morning, Lord Caterham." "Oh, good morning," said Lord Caterham. "Good morning. Nice day." "The weather is delightful," said Mr. Fish. He helped himself to coffee. By way of food, he took a piece of dry toast. "Do I hear correctly that the embargo is removed?" he asked after a minute or two. "That we are all free to depart?" Yes, said Lord Caterham. "As a matter of fact, I mean that I shall be delighted." His conscience drove him on. "Only too delighted if you will stay on for a little." "Why, Lord Caterham?" "It's been a beastly visit, I know," Lord Caterham hurried on. "Too bad. Shan't blame you for wanting to run away." "You misjudge me, Lord Caterham." The associations have been painful, no one could deny that point. But the English country life, as lived in the mansions of the great, has a powerful attraction for me. I am interested in the study of those conditions. It is a thing we lack completely in America. I shall be only too delighted to accept your very kind invitation and stay on." "Oh, well," said Lord Caterham, "that's that. Absolutely delighted, my dear fellow. Absolutely delighted." Spurring himself on to a false geniality of manner, Lord Caterham murmured something about having to see his bailiff, and escaped from the room. In the hall he saw Virginia just descending the staircase. "Shall I take you into breakfast?" asked Lord Caterham tenderly. "I've had it in bed, thank you. I was frightfully sleepy this morning." She yawned. "Had a bad night, perhaps?" "Not exactly a bad night. From one point of view, decidedly a good night." "Oh, Lord Caterham." She slipped her hand inside his arm and gave it a squeeze. "I am enjoying myself. You were a darling to ask me down. You'll stop on for a bit then, won't you? Battle is lifting the embargo, but I want you to stay particularly. So does Bundle." "Of course I'll stay. It's sweet of you to ask me." "Ah," said Lord Caterham. He sighed. "What is your secret sorrow?" asked Virginia. "Has anyone bitten you?" "That's just it," said Lord Caterham mournfully. Virginia looked puzzled. "You don't feel by any chance that you want to throw a boot at me? No, I can see you don't. Oh well, it's of no consequence." Lord Caterham drifted sadly away and Virginia passed out through a side door into the garden. She stood there for a moment, breathing in the crisp October air which was infinitely refreshing to one in her slightly jaded state. She started a little to find Superintendent Battle at her elbow. The man seemed to have an extraordinary knack of appearing out of space without the least warning. "Good morning, Mrs. Revel. Not too tired, I hope?" Virginia shook her head. "It was a most exciting night," she said. "Well worth the loss of a little sleep. The only thing is, today seems a little dull after it." "There's a nice shady place down under that cedar tree," remarked the superintendent. "Shall I take a chair down to it for you?" "If you think it's the best thing for me to do," said Virginia solemnly. "You're very quick, Mrs. Revel. Yes, it's quite true, I do want a word with you." He picked up a long wicker chair and carried it down the lawn. Virginia followed him with a cushion under her arm. "Very dangerous place, that terrace," remarked the detective. "That is, if you want to have a private conversation." "I'm getting excited again, Superintendent Battle." "Oh, it's nothing important." He took out a big watch and glanced at it. 10:30. "I'm starting for Wyvern Abbey in 10 minutes to report to Mr. Lomax. Plenty of time. I only wanted to know if you could tell me a little more about Mr. Cade." "About Mr. Cade?" Virginia was startled. "Yes, where you first met him and how long you've known him and so forth." Battle's manner was easy and pleasant enough. He even refrained from looking at her, and the fact that he did so made her vaguely uneasy. "It's more difficult than you think," she said at last. "He did me a great service once." Battle interrupted her. "Before you go any further, Mrs. Revel, I'd just like to say something. Last night, after you and Mr. Eversley had gone to bed, Mr. Cade told me all about the letters and the man who was killed in your house." "He did?" gasped Virginia. "Yes, and very wisely, too. It clears up a lot of misunderstanding. There's only one thing he didn't tell me, how long he had known you. Now I've a little idea of my own about that. You shall tell me if I'm right or wrong. I think that the day he came to your house in Pont Street was the first time you had ever seen him." "Ah, I see I'm right. It was so." Virginia said nothing. For the first time she felt afraid of this stolid man with the expressionless face. She understood what Anthony had meant when he said there were no flies on Superintendent Battle. "Has he ever told you anything about his life?" the detective continued. "Before he was in South Africa, I mean. Canada? Or before that, the Sudan? Or about his boyhood?" Virginia merely shook her head. "And yet, I'd bet he's got something worth telling. You can't mistake the face of a man who's led a life of daring and adventure. He could tell you some interesting tales if he cared to. If you want to know about his past life, why don't you cable to that friend of his, Mr. McGrath?" Virginia asked. "Oh, we have, but it seems he's up country somewhere. Still, there's no doubt Mr. Cade was in Bulawayo when he said he was. But I wondered what he'd been doing before he came to South Africa. He'd only had that job with Castles about a month." He took out his watch again. "I must be off. The car will be waiting." Virginia watched him retreat to the house, but she did not move from her chair. She hoped that Anthony might appear and join her. Instead came Bill Eversley, with a prodigious yawn. "Thank God I've got a chance to speak to you at last, Virginia," he complained. "Well, speak to me very gently, Bill, darling, or I shall burst into tears. Has someone been bullying you?" "Not exactly bullying me, getting inside my mind and turning it inside out. I feel as though I'd been jumped on by an elephant." "Not Battle?" "Yes, Battle. He's a terrible man, really. Well, never mind Battle. I say, Virginia, I do love you so awfully. Not this morning, Bill. I'm not strong enough. Anyway, I've always told you the best people don't propose before lunch." "Good Lord," said Bill. "I could propose to you before breakfast." Virginia shuddered. "Bill, be sensible and intelligent for a minute. I want to ask your advice. If you'd once make up your mind to it, and say you'd marry me, you'd feel miles better, I'm sure. Happier, you know, and more settled down. Listen to me, Bill. Proposing to me is your ID fix. All men propose when they're bored and can't think of anything to say. Remember my age and my widowed state and go and make love to a pure young girl." "My darling Virginia. Oh, blast, here's that French idiot bearing down on us." It was indeed Monsieur Lemoyne, black-bearded and correct of demeanour as ever. "Good morning, madame. You are not fatigued, I trust?" "Not in the least." "That is excellent. Good morning, Mr. Eversley. How would it be if we promenaded ourselves a little, the three of us?" suggested the Frenchman. "How about it, Bill?" said Virginia. "Oh, all right," said the unwilling young gentleman by her side. He heaved himself up from the grass, and the three of them walked slowly along, Virginia between the two men. She was sensible at once of a strange undercurrent of excitement in the Frenchman, though she had no clue as to what caused it. Soon, with her usual skill, she was putting him at his ease, asking him questions, listening to his answers, and gradually drawing him out. Presently he was telling them anecdotes of the famous King Victor. He talked well, albeit with a certain bitterness, as he described the various ways in which the Detective Bureau had been outwitted. But all the time, despite the real absorption of Lemoyne in his own narrative, Virginia had a feeling that he had some other object in view. Moreover, she judged that Lemoyne, under cover of his story, was deliberately striking out his own course across the park. They were not just strolling idly. He was deliberately guiding them in a certain direction. Suddenly, he broke off his story and looked round. They were standing just where the drive intersected the park before turning an abrupt corner by a clump of trees. Lemoyne was staring at a vehicle approaching them from the direction of the house. Virginia's eyes followed his. "It's the luggage cart," she said, taking Isaacstein's luggage and his valet to the station. "Is that so?" said Lemoyne. He glanced down at his own watch and started. "1,000 pardons. I have been longer here than I meant. Such charming company. Is it possible, do you think, that I might have a lift to the village?" He stepped out onto the drive and signalled with his arm. The luggage cart stopped, and after a word or two of explanation, Lemoyne climbed in behind. He raised his hat politely to Virginia and drove off. The other two stood and watched the cart disappearing with puzzled expressions. Just as the cart swung round the bend, a suitcase fell off into the drive. The cart went on. "Come on," said Virginia to Bill. "We're going to see something interesting." That suitcase was thrown out. "Nobody's noticed it," said Bill. They ran down the drive towards the fallen piece of luggage. Just as they reached it, Lemoyne came round the corner of the bend on foot. He was hot from walking fast. "I was obliged to descend," he said pleasantly. "I found that I had left something behind." "This?" said Bill, indicating the suitcase. It was a handsome case of heavy pigskin, with the initials H.I. on it. "What a pity," said Lemoyne gently. "It must have fallen out. Shall we lift it from the road?" Without waiting for a reply, he picked up the suitcase and carried it over to the belt of trees. He stooped over it. Something flashed in his hand, and the lock slipped back. He spoke, and his voice was totally different, quick and commanding. "The car will be here in a minute," he said. "Is it in sight?" Virginia looked back towards the house. "No?" "Good." With deft fingers, he tossed the things out of the suitcase. Gold-topped bottle, silk pyjamas, a variety of socks. Suddenly, his whole figure stiffened. He caught up what appeared to be a bundle of silk underwear and unrolled it rapidly. A slight exclamation broke from Bill. In the centre of the bundle was a heavy revolver. "I hear the horn," said Virginia. Like lightning, Lemoyne repacked the suitcase. The revolver he wrapped in a silk handkerchief of his own and slipped into his pocket. He snapped the locks of the suitcase and turned quickly to Bill. "Take it. Madame will be with you. Stop the car and explain that it fell off the luggage cart. Do not mention me." Bill stepped quickly down to the drive just as the big Lanchester limousine with Isaacstein inside it came round the corner. The chauffeur slowed down, and Bill swung the suitcase up to him. "Fell off the luggage cart," he explained. "We happened to see it." He caught a momentary glimpse of a startled yellow face as the financier stared at him, and then the car swept on again. They went back to Lemoyne. He was standing with the revolver in his hand and a look of gloating satisfaction in his face. "A long shot," he said, "a very long shot. But it came off